welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone, and in this video today I'm going to be responding to a brand new video essay that's just been published by Pop Culture Detective, and his video essay is called How the Last Jedi Defies Expectations. I'm going to respond to this essay for a couple of reasons. Number one, because several of you have sent me the link and you've said, can you please respond to this? I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts about his thesis that he's put forward in this video. So yeah, I'm going to do that. Secondly, because there are some glaring factual errors in this video essay that he's published. And these factual errors really strike at the heart of the thesis that he's trying to put forward about The Last Jedi. So if you've got facts that you're building your thesis on that are not correct, then of course the thesis is not going to be particularly reliable. And thirdly, this video is effectively one big straw man, one big mischaracterization, one big falsehood about why so many people have been so negative towards The Last Jedi, why this film has received so much fan backlash. And I think the fact that it's created this big straw man, this big false vision of why people are reacting negatively to this film is worthy of a response all by itself. Now, those of you who have been corresponding with me for a while now and saying, hey, when are you going to do more long form video? We want to see really long videos from you. Give us some more of that stuff. Well, here you go. Today is going to be some long form commentary. What we're going to do is we're actually going to start in a minute and we're going to start watching the video essay, and then we're just going to stop it at points and I'm going to make my responses as we go. Because I'm including Pop Culture Detective's original content and we're doing it this way, I might well lose monetization on this video. So if you want to support the channel, there is a link in the video description below for Patreon and for PayPal. You can do either, but please do that if you want to support the channel. Right, I'm going to put my headphones on now. I'm not impersonating PewDiePie. I need the headphones on so we can get some nice clean audio, and let's start watching this video essay together.
The Last Jedi is a movie that's designed to subvert audience expectations.
Okay, first of all, I'm not sure it actually is designed to subvert expectations. It's quite possible that it subverts our expectations because it wasn't particularly well crafted. It's not particularly well written and well made, and as a result, it's not an incompetent film, but there are big glaring flaws in it, particularly in the writing of it. And so it's quite possible that our expectations were not so much subverted as they were basically, the film failed to meet basic expectations that you would have of a film of this particular type. And it's quite conceivable that the reason why that happened was because there was a lack of skill or a lack of care shown rather than it being deliberate. Now, it's important to remember here one thing he said here, that it's designed to subvert our expectations. We're going to come back to this point because it actually seems to contradict where his thesis ends up at the end of this video, as you'll see, but we'll talk about that later. Just remember that point.
Nowhere is this more evident than in the way the film handles its three male heroes: X-Wing pilot Poe Dameron, renegade stormtrooper Finn, and legendary Jedi Knight Luke Skywalker. Initially, all three characters seem like they should fit neatly into familiar archetypes for men in action-adventure films. In Poe, we expect the hotshot fighter pilot who's celebrated for blowing up the bad guys.
Lock and load.
In Finn, we expect the noble defector who's determined to take down an unjust system. And in Luke, we expect the wise warrior who wields tremendous power in the name of fighting evil.
I don't think this is correct at all. I don't know about you, but my expectations going into this film, and one of the big reasons why is because of the way J.J. Abrams set the character of Luke up at the very end of The Force Awakens, was I didn't expect him to be an all-powerful wise warrior. I expected him to be a wise sage. I expected him to be Obi-Wan Kenobi 2.0. That's what I thought, and that's how he effectively appears to be set up. Everything about his look, and the fact that she's seeking him out, and the fact that he's living as a reclusive hermit indicates that that's what he's going to be. And that was the expectation I had. I didn't expect him to be this all-powerful and wise warrior who was going to take down the enemy. I thought he was going to provide important training, or perhaps like Obi-Wan did, go and fight perhaps a solitary battle somewhere that would help. But I never expected him to be the all-powerful warrior who was going to win the day for them.
But in each case, The Last Jedi doesn't deliver on those expectations, at least not immediately. Instead, director Rian Johnson throws fans a series of curveballs.
So now we're describing glaring problems in the writing of a film as curveballs. That's certainly one of the more creative descriptors that I've heard used to describe the problems in The Last Jedi, but I digress.
Over the course of the first act, Finn reveals his self-centered and defeatist attitude. Poe proves that he's reckless and arrogant, and Luke is so consumed by paralyzing guilt that he's renounced the Jedi and become a hermit. These unexpected character twists are part of the reason why some Star Wars fans left the theater in a state of shock, which rapidly mutated into fits of rage on the internet.
Okay, so here you can see this is where we start to get into the condescending, sort of passive-aggressive, insulting territory. These people were shocked, and then, because they lacked enlightenment. The enlightenment I'm going to give you about how deep and beautiful this film truly is. And then it morphed into fits of rage. And look, it's actually okay to be upset when you have a much beloved film, a much beloved franchise which you care about, and then it's treated and handled so poorly like it was in The Last Jedi. It's actually okay to be upset and angry about that. It doesn't make you a bad person, it just makes you a devoted fan. As long as that anger that you have is vented in appropriate ways and you don't lose the plot and you're not doing immoral, unethical things or unvirtuous things, then it's okay to be upset about this. There's nothing wrong with being shocked and about your shock and frustration being vented in other ways, despite what certain people will say.
Now, to be clear, we're not talking about people who just happen to dislike The Last Jedi. It is, after all, not a perfect piece of cinema.
You're right, it's not a perfect piece of cinema. It's actually it is the worst Star Wars film that's ever been released, and that's according to the fans, remember. And it's just not a particularly good example of filmmaking. It's certainly not a shining example of how to write a film. There's some pretty big and glaring flaws here, and there's lots of other critique videos that have already been done about this, so I'm not going to relitigate them. But it's not simply not a perfect film. It's actually a pretty glaring example of how you shouldn't do cinema, and it's certainly a terrible example of Star Wars, that's for sure.
No, we're talking about the subset of mostly male superfans who felt betrayed and personally disrespected by this movie.
Anything else?
Okay, first of all, to suggest that Star Wars fans who are, diehard lovers of Star Wars are a subset, I would argue that's basically a nonsense. That fails to understand Star Wars, the franchise and the fan base. Star Wars is one of the sort of pinnacle cinematic properties that has a devoted fan base, a diehard fan base. There's several of them that do have it, and not just movies, but in literature as well, where the fans really love, they have this devotion to Star Wars and they have a diehard love for it. And Star Wars is one of those. So to describe those fans as a subset, I think it's not correct, and it misunderstands the Star Wars fan base, firstly. Secondly, to suggest that they felt betrayed or personally attacked, it's just nonsense. I went into the film, I didn't feel betrayed, I didn't feel personally attacked by the movie. I was just hugely disappointed. I walked away from the film disappointed, and the more I thought about it, I realised why. Because this franchise, which I love so much, and this storytelling universe, which I love so much, had been so badly handled in this film that I was frustrated, I was sad about that, but I didn't feel that I was being targeted. I didn't feel like I had been betrayed by this at all. I just felt really frustrated and disappointed that such a pinnacle franchise, which has climbed great heights previously, had been treated so badly and so poorly, and this was what was being served up to us. That's quite a different sentiment, by the way.
The objections from that particular group are wide-ranging.
The two were accompanied by a girl.
But they often involve an obsessive level of scrutiny when it comes to female characters.
What girl?
Okay, interesting. So you notice what he starts by saying there, that the critiques that people make of The Last Jedi are wide-ranging, but then he immediately hones in on one, what I would argue is a very minor point, which in actual fact is insignificant really when you think about the total package of critique that people make about why this film is so flawed. The male-female character relations, the way they're presented, they're not really the fundamental pinnacle heart of why people are so frustrated with this film, but they are part of the problem, that's for sure. And by the way, just because they're a problem and people have noticed that problem, it doesn't make it invalid just because it's to do with male-female issues. As you'll see from this video as we progress, he's clearly down a particular track, an ideological track or a position that he holds himself, and he's allowed that ideological position to colour people and their disagreements about this film by obsessing about gender. We'll see more of that as this video essay unfolds.
On the more extreme end of the spectrum, fan complaints have a tendency to devolve into wild conspiracy theories about the Disney Corporation pushing an agenda of forced diversity or feminist propaganda.
Now, I don't want to respond to that now, but I want you to remember that point that he's just made. Because what he's claiming here is this is not deliberate, there's no agenda here in the film. We're going to come back to that point because at the end of this video essay, effectively, he appears to completely contradict his opening point here by what he says about the film and the way it handles male-female characters and the relations between the two. So just remember that point he's just made, that there's no agenda here to promote a particular feminist vision of masculine-feminine relations or reality of the world.
But there is a common thread running through much of the backlash that speaks to an underlying anxiety. An anxiety rooted in deep-seated insecurities about masculinity.
No. So this is where the video really goes off track. What I would suggest to you, Pop Culture Detective, is I don't think you're a psychologist, so don't try and psychoanalyze people who have disagreements with The Last Jedi. It's really absurd territory to get into for a couple of reasons. Number one is because you really don't know enough about these people to be able to make those kind of sweeping generalizations. And secondly, it just shows a very childish level of ad hominem attacking people. You are playing the man and not the ball. You're not addressing the actual arguments that people are making, you're just calling them names here. And to suggest that people have an insecurity in their masculinity and that's why they are frustrated about this film, or in particular the male-female relations and those aspects of the film, as I said, it's just childish nonsense. You're not qualified to analyse people in that way. Just don't do it. Focus on what the actual arguments people are making, and if you think you've got a valid critique where you can show their arguments to be false, then respond to those. But I can tell you personally that for me and for the people I've engaged with, I don't have a masculine insecurity. I'm a married man, I'm a father of 5 kids. I don't have time for masculine insecurity. And there is a difference between someone who is insecure in their masculinity and someone who sees what is a false portrayal or a disingenuous portrayal or effectively quite an insulting portrayal of male-female relations in a film. Now, I'm not saying this is necessarily true of this film, but if someone notices that about a movie, it doesn't mean they're insecure in their masculinity. So the question is what they're saying true? Even a person who's insecure in their masculinity can still notice a film that has presented a false vision of the world of male-female relations and reality between men and women and masculine greatness and feminine greatness. And they can still see that and they can still be right about that regardless of whether they're insecure or not. So it's actually irrelevant. So going down that path is pointless. It doesn't address the actual arguments and you're not really qualified to do it. It's just a cheap throwaway insult. So I would say just don't do it, mate. Get focused on the actual arguments and the positions that people are putting forward about the film.
Let me briefly explain what I mean by that. Leading men in action-adventure movies are expected to be decisive, righteous, respected, and to take charge in most situations. Men are expected to achieve success by becoming progressively more and more powerful as the story unfolds.
And this is where the factual errors really start to come into their own in this video essay. I would argue that you're completely wrong here about this point about power, or certainly the way you're presenting it here. Yes, the hero's journey. So first of all, I'm not going to do what you're doing here, which is trying to genderize the problem and make it about male-female and the male-female distinction. You're doing that because you have a particular ideological view of the world. Well, it seems that you do. That has, I could be wrong, but it's certainly that ideological view has coloured that third and fourth wave feminism and their view of male-female relations and their view of the world and the differences in the supposed, the patriarchy, the struggle between the two throughout human history seems to be colouring your essay here. But the point is, that men who are heroes, and it doesn't have to be men, any hero, yes, they do become more powerful as the film progresses, but not in the way that you are proposing here. This is not a Nietzschean will to power. It's not, they don't become powerful in the sense of they gain power and dominance over others. They become powerful by becoming more virtuous, and that's a different type of power to possess. Power that is about the sort of Nietzschean will to power and becoming stronger, and becoming the overman, the Übermensch, is actually about possessing and wielding power for your own gain. Becoming powerful in virtue is completely different, because virtue is directed outwards for the good of others. So you become powerful in a paradoxical way. You become powerful by becoming self-sacrificial. This is just the basic heart of mythology and how the hero's journey is supposed to work. And mythology is our attempt, in a very imperfect storytelling way, to grasp at these profoundly true realities about the human experience. And one of them is that you become powerful as a person by becoming more virtuous and by giving of yourself. So the hero, for example, who goes from being cowardly or afraid and who ends up being courageous and doing that courageous act, they have become powerful, but they haven't become powerful in a Nietzschean will to power kind of way. Now, the example you're using here on screen of Neo from The Matrix is as an outlier, and it's not a good example because Neo is a deity. Remember, he's the one. He's not your typical archetypal hero. He's actually a god in this film. That's the whole point of his character. He is an essential deity in that story. And so he actually does become powerful and wields a divine power. But that is not how heroes typically play out in a film. Instead, it's about, as I said, that you become powerful by self-giving, by self-sacrifice, through the practice of virtue. Now, the type of power you're talking about is not actually typical of a hero at all. It is typical of a villain. The villain is the one who takes power and uses it and wields it and becomes more powerful in the sense that they possess power. But a hero doesn't possess the power they wield. Instead, a hero becomes powerful by actually losing themselves, by surrendering, self-sacrifice, self-giving, love, virtue, those kind of important traits. And I would argue that's a big distinction and a very important one.
This expectation is part of a long-running tradition in Hollywood. And the formula is so entrenched in mass media that many fans feel aggressively entitled to seeing that particular version of manhood reproduced on the big screen.
Okay, first of all, aggressively entitled. Look, again, with the ideological language, it's not really helping here. I think what you're missing here is a really important point. So first of all, I don't think James Bond, who appears on screen, is a particularly good example of authentic masculinity and heroic masculinity. He's a cartoonish character. He's effectively an adult version of a cartoon character. He's not really an archetypal hero. And it's not really how I think how most people view him. So I don't think that's the best example to have up on screen as you're making this point. Secondly, what you seem to have missed here is that, as I said about mythology, mythology is our attempt to, albeit imperfectly, grasp at these profoundly important truths, these goods, these beautiful things about the human experience. And so the reason why people go to films and they expect to see their heroes, whether they're male or female, it doesn't matter about gender, whether they're male or female, they expect to see them act in certain ways where they overcome adversity, where they overcome their weaknesses and vulnerabilities, where they become more powerful in the sense that they become more virtuous and they actually flourish into their calling, is because that's how the human experience is actually supposed to work. And in that mythology and that storytelling, we recognize something good and true and beautiful there. We recognize that the only way that human beings really truly find their meaning is by becoming heroic in the practice of virtue. That it's only through self-giving. So for example, in my life, I'm a father and a husband. And if I want to be successful as a father and a husband, I have to actually practice self-giving love. I have to give of myself. I have to put others first. If I want to be a successful dad and a successful husband, I have to put them first. If I focus on my own happiness and my own pleasure as the primary goal of my fatherhood or the primary goal of my marriage relationship with my wife, I will fail at both. because they are not the primary goal, and they are not how I flourish and find myself as a human being. So in the hero's journey, we recognize something good that we should all imitate in our lives, even in very small ways on a daily basis. And so that's why it's not a sense of entitlement to walk into a movie theatre and to want to see reality portrayed on the screen in our heroes. It would be weird to walk into a movie theatre. We'd know something's really gone wrong in our culture when we're all walking into movie theatres and we are saying to ourselves, well, I want to see my heroes acting in selfish ways, or I want to see them neutered, and I want to see them without any sort of growth or development. That would be weird. Something would have gone wrong in our culture if that's how we now think of the human experience. Secondly, it would be weird because that would be very, very boring storytelling. The whole point of engaging and enjoyable storytelling is that your characters go on a journey and they have a character arc. They go from one position to a completely different position by the end of the film. They change, they develop in some way. And if it's the hero's character arc, the whole point is there should be a major positive development in the life of that character. And that means they have to overcome adversity, they have to overcome their frailties, their weaknesses. They have to come up against things that challenge them. And if they don't, and if they're already perfect, they're a Mary Sue. We're not going to get into that right now, but they're a Mary Sue, they're a boring character. There is no drama, there's no tension there, and there is no chance for heroism. When you think about heroism, if you've got a character who is already courageous and then they do a courageous thing at the end of a movie or the end of a story, okay, cool, that was courageous and that was heroic. But if you've got a character who starts a film and they are cowardly and they overcome their fears and they overcome their cowardice and then they do this courageous thing at the end of the film, we know that that is far more heroic because they have actually had to overcome a serious deficiency to do that good and right thing. And we recognise there's something true and beautiful and good about that, and there's something worth imitating. Not directly imitating, but imitating that same commitment to virtue and self-sacrifice and self-improvement. Our deliberate attempts to become more good and beautiful in our own actions and behaviour and conduct towards other people in the world around us. We recognise, and that's not a sense of entitlement. That's how the world should work. That's what we should get out of mythology. Mythology should be, as I said, it's our grasping at something good, true and beautiful, and it should be a call to us as well that calls us to something good, true and beautiful. It shouldn't be something where we go in there and we go, oh, what's going on here?
But as The Last Jedi begins, it quickly becomes apparent that this movie isn't interested in catering to a simple vicarious power fantasy.
And again, that is not authentic heroism. Heroism is not a Nietzschean will to power. It's not a power fantasy at all. It's not about possessing power. That's the villain's arc. And so this is a big mistake he's made here. It's a very big mistake. And it's a big flaw in his thesis here. Because the hero is not interested in wielding and becoming more powerful. The hero is the person who becomes more of a servant, more self-sacrificial, more self-giving to the world around them, to the people around them. That is not a power fantasy. That's not a power trip. It's the villain who rides the power trip. They're the one on the train to possessing and wielding power. Think about the Lord of the Rings, which very clearly enunciates this position. The villains are the ones who want to wield the ring of power. The heroes are the ones who recognise the burden of that and who want to actually give of themselves in order to save the world from that form of dominance and control. That's the difference. It's a very important distinction.
All three male heroes are presented as vulnerable in their fallibility.
Well, I mean, obviously, of course, because if you are vulnerable, then you're not going to be infallible, and if you're infallible, then you're obviously going to have vulnerability. So, yeah, yes.
With each displaying their own set of rather significant character flaws and inadequacies. Now, flawed heroes, in and of themselves, aren't all that unusual in speculative fiction.
You're right, they're not all that unusual. Heroes and characters are supposed to be flawed. That's the whole point. Because if they don't have flaws, they're a Mary Sue. If they're already perfect, they're a boring character, and we have no interest in them when we don't recognise ourselves in them. Because none of us is perfect. We are not perfect. And so, in those imperfect characters, And those flaws we see an echo of ourselves, and we see an echo of the truth about the human experience, and that's why we connect with it. We also see something else that's really important. We see an opportunity, or there's a chance for drama to exist in that story and in the progression of that character. If the character is perfect and they are flawless, they don't have flaws, there can be no drama. There's no dramatic tension. There's nothing for them to overcome. We know, even if it's only subconsciously when we're watching a film, oh, they're going to do that, they're going to do this, they're going to achieve that, this is not going to be a problem for them. There's no drama. There's no drama. And so it's not interesting. A story that lacks drama is not an interesting or compelling or good story. So it's not just common, it's actually the way good writing is supposed to work.
In fact, failure, and then learning to overcome that failure, is just the standard recipe for structuring a basic character arc.
Bingo. And that's exactly what I was just saying. So it's not just something that's not uncommon, it's the way it's supposed to be if you want to engage in good writing. That's why Rey is not a well-written character. She's already too perfect. It doesn't matter what gender Rey is. Rey could have been a bloke. Rey could have been R-A-Y, a bloke called Rey. And if Rey, the male version of R-E-Y, had been written the way the current character is written, it would still be boring and uninteresting as a character because it hasn't followed the basic premise of good writing. Rey is a Mary Sue, so there's no dramatic tension. She's already too perfect, and it means she can't go on a journey. She doesn't have an echo that we recognise that's true about her life that we recognise, and we recognise, even if it's only subconsciously, that there's no dramatic tension in her character. She's not interesting.
I'd argue the intense fan hate surrounding The Last Jedi has a lot more to do with the fact that the male heroes in this movie are directly challenged on their failures by women.
Leia.
And I would argue that you are 120% completely wrong about that point. Think about Terminator 2 and Aliens. What do those two films have in common? Those two films, which are much beloved movies, have strong female leads. And not only do they have strong female lead action heroes, but those strong female leads actually direct the men in those movies about how to become better and more effective heroes in that story. And yet, despite that fact, those two films are beloved movies, and you know what? It is predominantly men. By and large, the vast majority of fans, the people who took those films and elevated them to the heights of popular and much beloved sort of the status they enjoy, they were males. The very same males who are now watching The Last Jedi and who are going, this film is not well written, this film has failed. What that indicates to me is that your claim is not correct here, because I can show you other films where you have exactly what you're claiming people are backlashing against, and people are not backlashing against those films. Why? Because those films are actually well written, and those characters are well crafted, and they're interesting to us as an audience.
This is not something that's supposed to happen to space cowboys or space wizards in Hollywood blockbusters.
Well, okay, is that true? Because in actual fact, Hicks in Aliens is clearly a space cowboy. And he is clearly taught how to become a more effective hero. In fact, in the end, they're saved by Ripley, the female. So where does this idea come from that this is not supposed to happen to space cowboys? I mean, I clearly, you want the straw man to be correct. I can tell that. You're very committed to this idea. But where are you getting this idea from? Han Solo, the consummate space cowboy in the Star Wars trilogy, his character arc in the original trilogy relies intimately upon Leia. Without Princess Leia, he would not be completed as a hero and as a character. Not only that, but Princess Leia is the one who saves him in Return of the Jedi. And for much of that film, in Return of the Jedi, the first half, not only does she save him, but he then wanders around blind and incapable. So where are you getting this idea from that space cowboys are not supposed to be saved by women? I mean, seriously, what is the factual basis for making that claim? What is it that you've seen or you think you've seen in films and in Star Wars to back up that particular claim? Even think about the Jedis. If you consider the full canon of Star Wars, it is very common to have the Jedis, like the primary, archetypal heroes, at the service of females and female leaders. But let's go away from the space wizards and just think about wizards in general, and think about Gandalf, one of the other great wizards in mythology. In The Lord of the Rings, he's at the service of Lady Galadriel. He's not a character who does everything on his own. It's very cooperative. Again, it's about self-giving virtue. It's communal in nature. There's community to it. So again, I'd be interested to know, where is this idea coming from that space cowboys and space wizards are supposed to do this on their own?
Okay, listen.
Women aren't supposed to interfere with a man's heroic journey. So let's dig a little deeper into the unexpected ways that men are held accountable for their behavior in each of the movie's 3 intersecting storylines.
Okay, so the way he says that, the way in which men are held accountable for their behaviour, again, why are you saying that as if to suggest that characters, whether they're male or female, are not supposed to be normally held accountable for their bad behaviour or their errant behaviour in a movie? Like, this is common, again, this is just basic storytelling. If you've got a character who is acting in a way that is not good, who their behaviour is errant, they are supposed to be corrected at some point. They're supposed to come up against justice. They're supposed to come up against truth and goodness, which either corrects their behaviour or overcomes them because perhaps they're more villainous now. But the idea that they're not supposed to be corrected, that they're not supposed to be held accountable, that's not how storytelling works, and it's not what we see in film. So why? Where did that idea come from?
As many critics noted when The Last Jedi first hit theaters, the theme of women challenging male bravado is most evident in the character arc of Poe Dameron. Poe is a hotshot fighter pilot. He's impulsive, he's arrogant,
Disengage now, Commander. That is an order.
and he cares more about being a big damn hero than he does about effective strategy or even the lives of his compatriots.
Okay, he's made 3 claims there, and those 3 claims are not true. And this is what I was talking about factual errors. So first of all, before I get into the 3 claims and why they're not true that he's made about Poe Dameron here, this is what I was talking about before, the way in which the character of Poe has been quite dramatically altered between the first and the second film. In the opening of this first film now, he is all of a sudden a hotshot, hothead renegade. But in the previous film, he is so trusted by Leia that she's sending him on vitally important secret missions, which clearly indicates that he's not actually an impulsive, dangerous hothead. He's actually quite a balanced and important and stable leader in this resistance in the first film, but in the beginning of this one, all of a sudden, he's become this sort of petulant, very dangerous fighter pilot who just doesn't listen to orders all of a sudden. That's quite a big shift. But the 3 factual claims here that he makes about Poe Dameron are not correct. Number 1, in the opening sequence of this film, Poe, in fact, throughout most of this film, Poe is not obsessed with being a hero. There's no, interestingly, that's very much Luke's journey. If you go back to the original trilogy, and what do we see? Luke wants to be a hero. Remember at the very beginning, he wants to go off and fight and be a hero in this revolution. But that's not Poe. Poe's not obsessed, I've got to be a hero. Like, what is someone who is obsessed with heroism? They are obsessed with glory, with notoriety, with fame. That's not what motivates Poe Dameron in this film. Secondly, he's claimed here that Poe Dameron doesn't care about strategy. Again, that is completely not true as well. The very reason that Poe is obsessed with destroying this dreadnought is because of the fact that he believes it will give them an important strategic advantage. Now, he's not wrong here in his suggestion that if they are in a position to press home their strategic advantage and destroy a super weapon which is unrivaled, then they should actually, strategically, it would make sense to take advantage of that. He's right. So he is actually thinking strategically. He doesn't not care about strategy. That's not true. And thirdly, no, he's not interested in endangering his compatriots at all. The whole motivation here for Poe is that he wants to destroy this super weapon because it will save lives. If you can cripple the enemy with the super weapon, you are going to save more lives. And his character arc of wanting to save people's lives is very much what drives him throughout the rest of that film. So I would argue that those three claims that he makes there, they are factually incorrect. They're false. That they're not actually correct. He doesn't think in a way that's not strategic. He's not obsessed with becoming a hero, and he's not willing to actually ignore and sacrifice lives. He's someone who's committed to trying to save lives.
The gung-ho rebel pilot is a familiar archetype in Star Wars media, and as a result, we think we know how it's going to play out. Audiences expect the good guys to bring down the enemy death machine in a giant ball of fire. And we expect to revel in the joyful spectacle of impossible explosions in outer space.
Direct hit! Dreadnought down!
Well, again, I would question whether that's factually accurate, because I was sitting there in the opening minutes of that film, and I certainly didn't get a sense that we were supposed to be reveling in this destruction. There was very much a heavy sense of the toll, the cost that had been paid to win this victory. This is not like the destruction of the Death Star. And I would also question whether or not we are actually accustomed to gung-ho space pilots in the Star Wars trilogy. Yes, when you think about Han Solo, he is often a gung-ho pilot, but he's also often a pilot who pays for that gung-ho attitude. It's not like he is lauded for that. He is very commonly being critiqued or is getting himself into trouble because of his gung-ho nature. Remember that whole thing, oh no, they're not tracking this ship, sister. There's no way that's happening. Well, that's exactly what was going on, right? Anakin Skywalker also displays a gung-ho attitude towards his piloting at times, but here's the point, that's a very important character trait. It's not a positive thing. It's there to actually show you that he's impulsive, and that impulsiveness is actually a flaw in his character, because it's that impulsiveness which leads him to the dark side and to being deceived. And so I would argue that we're not actually presented with the idea that gung-ho space pilots should be celebrated or should be the norm. That's not really what we're presented with in Star Wars at all. And as I said, more importantly, it's not the sense that we get watching the opening sequence of this film that we're supposed to be celebrating, again, here, this gung-ho pilot. It's not like the destruction of the Death Star, which is something to celebrate.
But instead of framing Poe's daring raid on the Dreadnought as cause for celebration, the movie suddenly pulls the rug out from under us.
You're demoted.
Whoa, wait, we took down a dreadnought.
At what cost? There are things that you cannot solve by jumping in an X-Wing and blowing something up. I need you to learn that.
Okay, that's this is one of the frustrating lines for me in this film, because it doesn't really make sense for Leia, who's a military commander, to be saying this, and especially in this context, because in actual fact, Poe was right. If you can destroy a superweapon, then it would make sense to destroy the superweapon. And this is a very sort of classic example of where you would use your military capacity to achieve an outcome. It's not like Poe has done something here that doesn't make any sense contextually. It's not like Poe had an argument with someone, so he jumped in his X-Wing and then went and blew up their house to try and solve the problem that he had with that person. That would be an example where you would say to a person that you can't solve all your problems by jumping in an X-Wing and blowing things up. But in this context, the whole point of having X-Wings and the whole point of military engagement is so that you fight military battles, and that's what they were involved in. It was a military engagement. So it was always a jarring line for me. It's not a particularly well-written line, I think, in the context.
Poe is rebuked for his apparent victory, and by extension, the audience is rebuked for enjoying the fireworks. Again,
I was sitting in that audience, and I do not for a second believe that we were all sitting there going, yay, this is awesome, they've won the victory. We weren't sitting there celebrating the fireworks at all. This film very clearly presented to us, through the way in which that sequence plays out, that there were problems that went on there, that there was tension between characters, that people had died, and that this wasn't something just to gloss over or to celebrate or to ignore. There's no way this film sets itself up as if we're supposed to be celebrating this and then all of a sudden pulls the rug out from under us. It's very clear, if you follow that film and you were watching it from the beginning, that Leia was angry at him and that there was going to be a point at which that anger was going to simmer over in an actual face-to-face conflict, and he got a slap in the face for it, and that was going to happen at some point. It was obvious that was the outcome because that's how the film sets it up. It doesn't set it up one way and then pull the rug out from under us at all.
Those explosions that we were taking such pleasure in just moments ago are abruptly reframed as cause for self-reflection and sadness.
Again, no, we weren't celebrating them. And no, they weren't set up that way. The whole point was they were tinged with the serious cost that was involved in winning this particular battle, and also the conflict that was involved in the actual commanders and the leaders on the rebel side, the resistance side of the fight.
And we find ourselves suddenly confronted with a narrative about consequences. For some Star Wars fans, it must have felt as if Princess Leia had just reached out of the movie screen and personally slapped them across the face.
No. Why would you think that? Did you have that experience? I didn't. I didn't have that. I mean, like, seriously, what makes you think that that's the experience that people would have had, that they are being targeted? It's personally all about them. Like, to me, this is really odd. I read stories and I might see echoes of humanity in them, but I don't read stories in the sense where I go, this is directed at me directly. This character, Princess Leia, is correcting me. No, I see her correcting another character, and I might see a recognition about my own failures or my own virtue in that, or what yeah, go Leia, or no, that's awful. But I don't sense that this is a rebuke directed at me for my supposed audience participation in the story.
Now, it's noteworthy that blowing up the space fascist death ray isn't framed as morally wrong. Instead, we're asked to consider the tactical and human cost of that violence. If ever a beloved leader is incapacitated, we expect our brash hero to suddenly find themselves in command. But that doesn't happen either.
The chain of command.
Well, maybe. Maybe. What often happens, though, is that the brash hero actually still has to overcome their own insecurities, their own weaknesses and frailties before they come to a conclusion, a satisfying conclusion, where they actually show good leadership themselves. I don't know if it's necessarily just assumed that they will step into the leadership role and then be celebrated for it and be a good leader, which seems to be perhaps what he's sort of angling at here.
It is clear as to who should take her place. Vice Admiral Holdo of the cruiser Ninka.
Vice Admiral Holdo is even less sympathetic to Poe's attitude than General Leia.
I've dealt with plenty of trigger-happy flyboys like you. You're impulsive, dangerous, and the last thing we need right now.
She harshly chastises Poe for his recklessness and rightly dismisses his antics as a liability to their mission.
Now, this is interesting because the relationship between the two of them and the way Holdo is portrayed is one of the big problems in this film, particularly in the context of who and what she's supposed to be as a character. And that scene there, I think, actually typifies the problem. The way she is treating him in the context of the situation they find themselves in, and the pressing and urgent need that they have, and the way she's reacting to one of her important military leaders, her important pilots, actually shows failings on her side. And the way he reacts to it is actually, I think, very measured and controlled. It actually shows a measure of virtue. He just sort of shrugs his shoulders. He doesn't get violent at her. He doesn't attack her. He doesn't scream and rant and rave at her. He shows that he's actually got temperance, that he's got prudence, that he's able to sort of stop and step back and control and to think about his actions. Again, this is not really consistent with the supposed hothead that we start out the film with him being. Remember, we're told he's set up as a hothead? Well, here he's being the exact opposite. And I would argue that there's an inconsistency in the writing here, if that's truly what you're trying to do. And this is what makes me think that Rian Johnson didn't necessarily set out to subvert expectations, that it actually happened because he just wasn't necessarily up to the task, whether that's because of his skill level or because he just didn't quite understand the franchise he had in front of him and the type of film that he needed to make. But this is an example of that sort of contradictory writing style.
And this is really what's at the heart of why so many angry fans tend to hate Vice Admiral Holdo's character so much.
No, that's not true at all. The reason that people find Vice Admiral Holdo so frustrating as a character is because the way she's written doesn't make sense. If she is supposedly this excellent military leader, Why, oh why, is she keeping such an essential secret from the people who need to know that secret? Why, oh why is she doing this? Let's not critique the plan itself and some of the flaws in that others have pointed out, but why is she keeping the secret? That's the big problem. And why is she treating her senior military leaders that are under her command in the way that she is, with such disdain? My young daughters who watched the film totally untainted, no expectations from Dad, they watched it themselves first time on home theatre release, and they had the same reaction that I did. My 9-year-old twin daughters said to me, they didn't like her. They kept asking me, is she a baddie? Is she a bad character, Dad? Is she one of the villains? Because the way she was acting, in their minds, their young childlike minds, they instinctively know that's not how a hero is supposed to act. And so straight away they recognised in her traits that were actually villainous, or that were portents which indicated she could be villainous. My 11-year-old daughter said to me several times, I don't trust her. There's something not trustworthy about her. Interesting that children are seeing exactly the same thing as us adults, that she's not a well-written character. And that's where the frustration comes in, because she isn't a well-written character, and more than that, she's not even very well-rounded. She's not fleshed out properly. And then when it comes for that big moment of heroic self-sacrifice of hers, there's no real meaning for us, because she's not well-rounded, not fleshed out enough as a character, and she's not a likeable character either. That's the problem with Holdo. It's got nothing to do with her gender. You could take Vice Admiral Holdo and you could make Vice Admiral Holdo a male, and if you wrote her in the same way as she is written in The Last Jedi currently, people would still have the same dislike for her as a character.
What you brought us to?
Get this man off my bridge.
Now, see, this is interesting because all of a sudden we have what? We have Poe here back as the hothead again. He reacts with no impulse control. Again, this sort of the swinging character. They just set a tone and stay with it, whichever way you're going to go. It's an important lesson in writing, I think.
Poe Dameron's story is that of a cocky, headstrong, never-tell-me-the-odds style male hero who is repeatedly reprimanded.
You have bet the survival of the Resistance on bad odds and put us all at risk?
And that was one of the frustrating scenes for a lot of people in that film. How dare she get angry at him for trying to do something to save everyone? They're in this extremely desperate situation, and she is acting in such a way to indicate that she doesn't care about what's happening, or she might even be complicit as a villain in what's going on. And so you've got a guy who actually shows what good leadership is supposed to be all about. He takes initiative and says, well, if she's not going to save us, then I'll do the right thing. How is he supposed to know that she actually is enacting a plan to save them all when she won't tell them? She's keeping that a secret. How's he supposed to know that? How's that good leadership? It's not. And that's why as a character she's so frustrating to those of us who sort of think a bit more clear-headed, I would argue, about this film and the way it's written.
Until he finally learns to listen to and trust women in positions of power. As Episode 8 begins, Finn is a man obsessed. He wants nothing more than to find his friend Rey and then get as far away from the war as he possibly can. Finn's intentions are selfish and driven by a lack of faith.
Which is interesting because when you go back and you watch The Force Awakens, Finn has already gone on that character arc, and at the end of The Force Awakens, he is selfless. He's willing to sacrifice himself for a friend and not just think about saving his own skin. And yet here we are now, and he's effectively gone back in his character arc. He's gone backwards. Again, the writing of the film is the flaw here.
He's convinced that the fight against the First Order is a lost cause.
Sorry, but this fleet is doomed, and if my friend comes back to it, she's doomed too.
Enter Rose Tycho, a low-ranking maintenance worker who's a fan of Finn's exploits from The Force Awakens.
Gotta get back to what I was doing, so...
What were you doing?
When she realizes he's not really the committed Resistance hero that she's heard stories about, her disappointment is palpable. Rose takes on the role of Finn's guide and mentor.
Come on.
Look, this whole place is beautiful. I mean, come on. Why'd you hate it so much?
Look closer.
She's the one who pulls back the curtain to expose the oppression festering just below the surface of the galaxy.
And who do you think these people are? There's only one business in the galaxy that'll get you this rich.
War.
Unlike Leia and Holdo, Rose holds no formal position of power, but she does speak from a position of moral authority.
I wish I could put my fist through this whole lousy, beautiful town.
She articulates the political and moral reasons why the resistance is necessary.
Does she? I don't think she does speak from a voice of moral authority at all. Because a person who is a moral authority is someone who is consistent. They don't just say moral things, they live a moral and virtuous life. So think about this. What's with the setup in this particular film? The setup is that even the resistance is involved in buying weapons from these evil people, and therefore they are helping to perpetrate evil in the galaxy. They are complicit in this. She is part of that group, so therefore she is complicit. If she knows this is going on and she's willing to be part of this group that's helping to prop up this evil, I would argue that doesn't make you a moral authority. That makes you someone who is morally confused or morally hypocritical. So is she really the voice of moral reasoning? Secondly, at one point she effectively tells us that saving those horses, saving some animals, is the moral equivalent to saving human lives, to saving persons from evil, from harm and destruction and from death, and saving persons from this brutal subjugation at the hands of the First Order, the whole galaxy. That saving a small group of animals is somehow morally equivalent to that. To me, that doesn't show a very good understanding of morality at all. And again, the whole thing about she demonstrates the necessity for the resistance. Well, if the resistance is complicit in the very problems she's identifying here, why is the resistance necessary? How are they a necessary cure for that problem if they're contributing to the problem? This is a confused moral philosophy here. And if you're suggesting that she's actually a strong voice of moral authority, I would question whether that's accurate based on some of those important points.
And in doing so, she inspires Finn to finally identify as a rebel.
You always scum.
Now, this is an interesting point. Is it the fact that she is a mentor to Finn and inspires him to do that, or is Finn just doing what he's done previously in The Force Awakens? He develops a friendship with the young woman, and his friendship and loyalty to her is what motivates him to follow her. I would argue that's the more likely answer to the question, why is Finn doing this? As opposed to, he's been mentored now and he's developed morally and he's realised what the truth is. It seems to me that he's simply repeating the same character traits and behaviours that we've seen previously in him, which is follow his female friend wherever she goes.
Rebel scum.
And it's her role as moral compass to both Finn and to the audience that's responsible for a good portion of the rage directed at Rose's character from the more toxic side of Star Wars fandom.
Okay, so first of all, how is she a moral compass to us, the audience? How is she a moral compass in this film? Like I've said, she's already morally conflicted if she's involved with a group that is propping up what she's identified as a grave evil, an industry that is leading to the destruction of human lives, which is leading to inequality between persons, which is leading to slavery and child slavery. The frustrating thing about her as a character is just the way she's written. The moment of self-sacrifice, which we're going to get to in a moment, that was one of the big frustrating things for people when she interfered with that moment of self-sacrifice that Finn was about to engage in. And also the whole Canto Bight thing is so very unnecessary, and she feels in many ways redundant as a character because she's so involved in that needless subplot. It's got nothing to do with the fact that she's a female. It's got everything to do with the fact that this is not a well-written film, and people get frustrated by characters and scenarios that are not well written. And so they should, if they have a love for good storytelling.
Many of these guys can't help but view a woman who is serving as teacher to a male hero as anything other than preachy, annoying, or emasculating.
Are you kidding me?
Again, absolute garbage. Aliens, Terminator 2. This is garbage. Like I said, I'm a father, I'm a husband. I don't have time to be emasculated, and movies don't emasculate me. Movies are either good or they're bad. They're enjoyable or not enjoyable. They're either well written or poorly crafted, right? This is a poorly crafted film. It's an unenjoyable film. It's got nothing to do with your Freudian attempts to try and psychoanalyze people who didn't like this film. I just wouldn't do it. You're not qualified to do it. You don't know these people well enough to do it. And it's just a childish ad hominem insult against people for simply disagreeing with you about the quality of this film. It doesn't make them bad, toxic people who have masculinity issues. It's a very passive-aggressive and condescending way of getting out of actually answering the real flaws that lie at the heart of this movie.
The fact that Rose also happens to be played by an actress of color only magnifies their anger.
I mean, how do you respond to that? Seriously, how do you respond to the absurdity of this? So, hear that, folks. If you didn't like The Last Jedi, and particularly the writing of the character of Rose Tico, not only are you a sexist, but clearly you're a racist as well. Look, what can I say? Pop culture detective, you need to just stop doing this. This is just silly, childish nonsense. It's passive-aggressive, condescending rubbish. The problem is you're not addressing the actual arguments that people are putting forward. You're not addressing the points, the very valid points people are making about the flaws in the writing of this character. Calling people racists and sexists for identifying bad writing, it's not going to work. We want to go and see good stories. That's what we want. And we just don't buy into this nonsense. So it's really, you're wasting your time even throwing those kind of insults around.
The other reason for the backlash against Rose is because she interrupts Finn's big heroic sacrifice. During the film's final battle, Finn embarks on a self-destructive charge. His heart is finally in the right place, but his judgment is clouded by his eagerness to act on his newfound convictions. As the movie makes clear, Finn's suicide attack is doomed to fail. Poe tells him so.
Now, pull her up! What? The cannon is charged! It's a suicide run!
Rose tells him so.
It's too late, don't do this!
No! I won't let them win!
And we see Finn's rickety airspeeder falling apart around him.
Okay, again, I would challenge the factual accuracy of this claim that the movie makes it explicit that this will fail as a strategy. It does not make that explicit at all. Even the examples, the three things he cites, the comment from Rose, the comment from Poe, and the fact that his ship is starting to disintegrate, none of those things are explicit proof that this will fail as a strategy. If that's what Rian Johnson was intending, he needed to write the film better. And all he needed to do was change the line that Poe delivered a little bit so that he clearly stated, it's fully charged, there's nothing we can do now, it's indestructible, or something along those lines, and then we would know explicitly that this was going to fail. What we do have here is explicit proof that this will definitely cost him his life. But that's not the same thing as explicit proof that it won't work. And so I would challenge the factual accuracy of this claim. The movie doesn't make it explicitly clear. In fact, it's a very common trope to have people try and advise heroes out of making a self-sacrificial run that's going to save people's lives. It's also very common to see a person in a state, whether in a vessel or a vehicle of some kind, which begins to disintegrate and fall apart, and we find ourselves thinking, are they actually even going to make it? And it adds to the tension. That's why it's done. It is not a trope which indicates failure at all. So I would challenge the factual accuracy of this claim. I don't think the movie does make it explicitly clear. Instead, the way this movie sets it up is that this is definitely a self-sacrificial act, that if he carries on with it, that he will definitely die, and that actually adds to the dramatic tension of what he's about to do.
But Finn is so focused on striking a blow against the First Order that he can't see how ineffective this strategy is. Understanding that his action amounts to a noble but senseless sacrifice.
Okay, first of all, something can't be senseless and noble at the same time. If something is virtuous, which is what it would be if it was noble, then it's not senseless. To do a virtuous thing is never to do a senseless thing. If something is senseless, it can't be virtuous. Because if it's senseless, it would lack prudence. it would lack, an orientation towards the good. I mean, senselessness is something that is an indication of evil, not goodness. So it can't be noble and senseless at the same time. But I digress.
Rose steps in to save Finn from himself. The heroic sacrifice is part of a long tradition in media, wherein death is framed as a way for men to prove their bravery, their convictions, their love, and even their manhood.
Hello, boys! I'm back!
And movies tend to romanticize images of men going out in a blaze of glory.
We did it! The son of a bitch did it!
Now here's the thing. The reason that movies consistently show acts of self-sacrifice and they romanticize and they glorify these things is precisely because we know, this is a mythology again, grasping at a very important truth here. We recognize that if a person is willing to sacrifice their very life for other people, especially if it's people they don't even know, like in the Independence Day example, to save the whole world, we recognize that that is the pinnacle of authentic virtue. That is the pinnacle of authentic love. That to give of your very life for another person or another group of people is the most loving act that you can do for those people. It's a truly profound and heroic thing to lay down, to transcend, to overcome your strongest instinct, your desire for self-preservation, and to surrender your very life, which you don't have to do, but to willingly do that for the good of other people is the most profound and beautiful and good act of love that can ever be done between persons. That's why we recognize it and romanticize it. It's not a negative thing that it's romanticized. It's not a negative thing that we celebrate that and we look to that and that is a common thing. It's a very good thing that it's common because it indicates our society still recognizes the truth of that. That self-sacrifice is essential to authentic love. As I often remind my daughters, in a couple of years' time, they're going to have plenty of young fellas knocking on the door and they're going to tell them and promise them all sorts of things. They're going to tell them how much they love them. And I keep reminding my daughters that there's one sure way to ascertain whether a man is telling you the truth when he says that he loves you. Look at his actions. Think about his actions. Is he willing to put your best interests ahead of his own wants and desires? Because if he says that he loves you, but he doesn't actually put your well-being ahead of what he wants, he's constantly self-gratifying instead of self-giving, then you can be certain that this is just words. That when he says he loves you, what he really means is either he's just saying things that he thinks you want to hear, or what he really means is, I get a good feeling, I get pleasure from being around you. In other words, I'm sentimental about you. But being sentimental about a person is very different from loving a person. Loving a person is a concrete, tangible action, the action of self-sacrifice. And that's why we recognize and romanticize and celebrate self-sacrifice, because we recognize it as being the purest form of love that you can show for another person. And it's just so essential to our flourishing as human persons as well. So there's nothing bad or negative about that.
Even when their sacrifice is senseless, ineffective, or unnecessary.
Okay, so he talks about sacrifices being senseless and needless and unnecessary, and then the two examples that he cites here are the exact opposite. So I'm assuming he's seen both of these films. Well, I hope maybe he hasn't seen both of these films. That's why he's used them as examples. So the example of Rose and Jack, in order to save Rose's life, to guarantee that he saves her, Jack has to sacrifice himself. There's no way for him to be on that door with her. Please don't tell me that you have bought into the meme. It's a very funny meme, but the meme going around about how Jack could have climbed aboard that door. Go and watch the Mythbusters episode about this very issue, and what you'll find out is that the only way that would have worked is if she had have taken off her life preserver and they had have tied that somehow underneath the door to actually create the necessary buoyancy. But if they hadn't done that, then they wouldn't have both been able to get on that door and survive. So the one sure way that he guarantees her survival is by doing that. And if he ties the life preserver underneath. First of all, he's got to attach it somehow. Secondly, he's got to prevent it from flying out from underneath the bottom of the door, which is actually commonly what happens. If you know anything about buoyancy, if you've been around life vests, if you've been around buoyant materials in the water, and this is something I'm familiar with, then what happens is they will try and get to the surface in the quickest and most direct way possible. They don't generally stay put. So in order for this to actually work, they would have to somehow figure out a way to do this, and it's not clear at all in the movie that they can actually do it. So it really is sort of splitting hairs here. It's getting caught up in effectively, which is a form of semantics and a meme. It's funny, it's hilarious, but no, in that film, his sacrifice is absolutely essential. Secondly, with the character of Nux in Mad Max Fury Road, his sacrifice is absolutely essential. There's no question about that. They have the supervillain sitting on the top of that truck. They have Immortan Joe's armies following closely behind. And if he doesn't flip that truck and cause it to block up that choke point and to buy them time, then Furiosa, Mad Max, and the rest of the harem of women that have escaped from Immortan Joe's clutches, they will almost certainly be captured and killed. So his sacrifice is absolutely essential. I'm confused as to why you'd be using those two examples. If you're uncertain, go back and watch those films again and you'll see that absolutely their self-sacrifice is not needless. It is not senseless. It's actually truly heroic, especially with the character of Nux. It's a character who has gone from one very extreme position where he starts the film to the exact opposite. And you know what else? It's motivated by love. He falls in love with a girl, and he proves his love by laying down his very life. This is what authentic love actually looks like. It's great filmmaking. The Last Jedi, not so much.
This notion that death, and violent death in particular, is redemptive or restorative for men is so deeply ingrained in media that many angry fans are adamant that Finn's misguided kamikaze attack would have succeeded.
Okay, first of all, it's not about violent death. Again, see how he's framing it? It's a straw man here. He's framed it all in a way that supports a straw man position. It's not about the fact if you die a violent death, then that makes you heroic. It's about the self-sacrificial nature of the dying. It doesn't matter whether it's violent or not. It could be very quick and instantaneous. It's about the self-sacrifice. And by the way, I noticed he mentions nothing at all about Vice Admiral Holdo and her self-sacrificial act, which happens around the same time in this movie, which is interesting. I sort of completely ignored that, I thought, rather glaring point. The point is, it's not about the violence or the dying. It's about the self-sacrifice. That's where the heroism is found. And again, to suggest that his plan would not have worked, the movie does not make that explicitly clear at all. Instead, that is a very open-ended question as far as the writing of this film goes. And if the intention was that it wasn't supposed to work, it should have been written better. Right?
These fans are incensed that a woman got the big damn hero moment.
No. Again, where are you getting this idea from? Where are you getting this idea from? We've seen female heroes have big heroic moments in Star Wars previously. Not only that, but go back again. Aliens, Terminator 2, you have women with the big damn hero moments in those films. Ripley in particular at the end of Aliens saves the day. In fact, throughout the whole franchise, she is the hero who keeps saving the day. And that franchise is beloved predominantly, by far and away, an overwhelming majority male audience. So please, enough of the childishness and the silly claims that this is just sexism. It's not. It's about bad writing and about people who recognise that in actual fact, this appeared to be an effective way of doing something truly heroic, and she interfered with that, and then she utters an absurd line, which again, he doesn't mention the absurd line that she utters, which makes no logical sense. Of course, if you want to save what you love, you have to fight what you hate, what's evil. If you love good and you want to save good and work for virtue and live for virtue and save that as virtuous, which is virtuous, you have to hate that as evil and you have to fight against it. It's logically, it's a nonsensical line she utters, and it's made even more comical. You know, I saved you, and then in the background, the big laser battering ram blows a whopping great hole in the wall behind them, just adding comical insult to injury. It is almost a comedic moment when that happens. It's like, oh, this is supposed to be serious, and then you realise.
And she got it, in their view, by robbing a male hero of his chance at martyrdom.
Why would you?
No, again, this is this fallacious straw man. Imagine instead that with Rose Tico you have a character called Dave Tico, and Dave Tico does exactly the same thing that Rose does. You would be angry at that character as well. We all would. It doesn't make any sense. That's why it's not good writing. It's got nothing to do with male or female or, you know, sexism. It's about bad writing, and it's not about martyrdom. It's about self-sacrifice. If you taint the language, you're tainting the pot. It all helps to add to the straw man when you craft the language in a particular way when you describe what's going on. This wasn't martyrdom. It wasn't senseless. It wasn't self-destruction. It wasn't suicide. Suicide is very different from self-sacrifice. It was an attempt to give of his life to save his friends. The pinnacle of authentic virtue, the pinnacle of authentic love.
You stop me!
I saved you.
And there it goes, and he cuts off that excellently comedic moment. I saved you! Kaboom! And here's the interesting thing. She then proceeds to steal a kiss from him. #MeToo. She steals a kiss from him. And the interesting point about all of this is that doesn't that sort of lend credence to the fact that she's actually only acting for her own self-interest? It's not really virtue that's motivating her. It's the fact that she's blinded by her infatuation with Finn. Remember, it's established at the very beginning. You even pointed out in this video that she's infatuated with this guy. And now she's really infatuated with him. She's physically attracted to him. Isn't it possible that her own blind adoration of this man caused her to actually override what was, rationally speaking, the truly good and authentic, virtuous thing to do by crashing into him that way?
When Rey finally meets her hero, the legendary Jedi Knight isn't at all what she expected.
Got milk? Sorry. Couldn't help myself.
Luke Skywalker has become a cynical old hermit. A man so consumed by fear and guilt that he's turned his back on the Resistance and closed himself off to the Force. Needless to say, this comes as a tremendous shock, both to Rey and to the audience.
You're right, it came as a tremendous shock for a couple of reasons. Number one, that's not how he's set up. In the end of this film, at the end of the first film, he's set up as being a wise old sage. And now he's not that at all. It's an interesting idea. And most people didn't have any problem with that concept. The problem is the execution of the concept. What we see in Luke now does not make any real sense when you contrast that with the character of Luke Skywalker that we were left with at the end of Return of the Jedi, the last time we saw him. There's been this massive change in him, a huge change. He's not just an older man struggling with weakness. He is now a completely different character. His character, and I don't mean the written character, his character as a character is now questionable. His character was impeccable previously. What the heck has happened to take a man from having an impeccable character and commitment to virtue to now being a man whose character is highly suspect? You've got to give us good reasoning for that. You've got to give us good reasoning for that. Having him standing over his nephew and being willing to murder him in order to save the galaxy, that's a new Luke Skywalker. That's not just development. That's a whole brand new, different character. And you've got to give a good chain of evidence, if you like, to show how that's happened in his life. And this film doesn't do that.
Like Rey, many Star Wars fans were expecting Luke to appear as a triumphant badass.
I would disagree with that. Again, I would question whether that's factually accurate at all, because Luke has never been a triumphant badass, quote unquote. There are sort of these brief moments where he shows, it's like, oh, that was pretty cool. But he's not presented as this heroic badass who swoops in and saves the day all the time. His progression throughout the first trilogy is a slow progression. He only really truly becomes a fully developed warrior in the very final film, and really it's only at the very end of that final film. So I'm not convinced that we were expecting that. I certainly wasn't expecting that. I was expecting the wise old sage. What I thought he would be is that he would be the guy who would be the new Obi-Wan Kenobi, who would teach them the essential wisdom they need to know in order to be effective warriors. Not that he would be the warrior himself, not that he would save the day. That he would save the day by teaching them, by transmitting the truth to them, so that they could live out the truth in their own heroic journey that they're on.
The one they remember, or rather misremember, from the original trilogy. The thing is, Luke was never really depicted as a great Jedi warrior.
Again, that's not true. Luke is actually depicted as a great Jedi warrior by the end of Return of the Jedi. Now, he's not depicted as a great Jedi warrior through the whole trilogy, because he's not. He actually has a character arc, unlike Rey, who just all of a sudden is an all-powerful Force user, an all-powerful Jedi, an all-powerful pilot. But Luke's not like that. He actually has a character arc, and a meaningful character arc. So he starts out as a young boy who's inexperienced, who's hot-headed, and then he needs to grow through that and learn. But by the end of Return of the Jedi, he is a great Jedi warrior. He definitely is. And he has proved himself by doing this truly heroic and virtuous and brave thing, and for the right motivation. He has become a great warrior. There's no doubt about that. He has bested the best in the galaxy, right? And he's done it in a way that's virtuous. And at the beginning of Return of the Jedi, before he gets to that point, he also shows that he has a fullness to his Jedi powers now that had been lacking previously. So to claim that he was never portrayed as a great Jedi warrior, I'm sorry, but that's not an accurate or factually correct statement about what the first trilogy gave us when it came to the character of Luke Skywalker.
Han, can you reach my lightsaber? Yeah, sure.
When Luke says this,
You think what? I'm gonna walk out with a laser sword and face down the whole First Order?
his words are a reaction to Rey's assumptions. But those lines can also be read as a response to fan expectations.
Why? Like I said, I'm a fan. A really diehard fan of Star Wars. I love Star Wars. To me, it's my go-to franchise. I love it. One of the great mythologies. But I never went in there expecting Luke to wield a lightsaber and to be the all-powerful warrior who was going to save everyone. I never went in expecting that. I mean, maybe some people did, but I would argue that that was not the majority fan position here. And it's certainly not why people were frustrated with the character of Luke. Again, it's a straw man. You're ignoring the big problem here, which is the way the character is written. Even Mark Hamill himself has pointed out that when he first read this and saw what Rian Johnson has done, he disagreed strongly with it. He didn't like what he'd done. The problem was not about expectations and what we thought Luke was going to be. It's about the way the character has actually been written.
As I mentioned earlier, it's assumed that Hollywood heroes, especially men, will grow exponentially more powerful over time.
Now you see how that factual error has now come back to inform a false straw man thesis here? Because it's not about a Nietzschean will to power. In fact, the very example he's citing here, Gandalf, the wizard in Lord of the Rings, it's not what happens to Gandalf. Interestingly, it's through self-sacrifice that Gandalf the Grey returns as Gandalf the White, but Gandalf the White is not all-powerful. Gandalf the White still has to fight alongside and communally with every other hero in Middle-earth in order to save the day. He can't save the day single-handedly. He's now a wise sage of a character too. He is more of a wise sage to those characters and the way he instructs them and teaches them and journeys with them. But he's not all-powerful. He hasn't suddenly become the super wizard who will now save everyone. So that very example, again, disproves the claims that are being made here. But you can see how if you start with that error, that being a hero, particularly a male hero, is all about a will to power. It's about having dominance and power and effectively becoming a deity. You start with that error and then you end up, again, drawing these conclusions that are not correct at this end of the thesis.
The expectation is that once a man has conquered his demons, those demons will stay conquered forever.
Again, Where are you getting that idea from? Because I don't know of anybody who thinks about storytelling in that way. That you just conquer your demons and then that's it. In fact, it's a very common trope to have heroes, and particularly male heroes, who are haunted by their past demons, by their frailties, by their mistakes. If they've come from the dark side to the light side, they've gone from being a villain to being a hero, from fighting for evil for fighting to good, it's very common for them to have those temptation moments, for that never to be fully dealt with. The idea that we sort of have this character who overcomes their demons and then never ever, and effectively they become perfect. Maybe if you're talking about Neo from The Matrix, but even then, once the subsequent 2 films arrived, he is no longer all-powerful and flawless. But the point about Neo is he's the one, he's a deity. He's not your typical human hero. So if that's the sort of starting point you're using, that's the outlier. It's not the norm. Because in actual fact, most heroes still do struggle and still have to overcome that. And that's where the courage and the heroism comes into it. The old saying that courage is not the absence of fear, it's doing the right thing in spite of fear. And so that frailty, that weakness still exists, but their love for what is good and true and beautiful becomes stronger in the person to the point where they're willing to do what is good despite the cost. And that's very different from someone who is now invincible and is infallible and no longer has any imperfections or weaknesses.
Never.
But even though Luke rejected the dark side back in Return of the Jedi,
I'll never turn to the dark side.
his struggle to resist the temptation of absolute power isn't over.
Well, first of all, what the scene here, it doesn't show Luke wanting absolute power. So you've made a reference to him wanting absolute power, but that's not why he was going to kill his nephew. He was going to kill his nephew because he thought it would save the galaxy. That's a very different thing. So you see how that era, again, is now informing an incorrect thesis. The era that being a hero is about absolute power, and that's what we are presented with commonly on screen, he's now trying to make the facts actually fit this straw man. It's not correct. Luke here believes he is acting to save the galaxy. But here's the problem. This is a very different type of Luke Skywalker, like I said. It's one thing to have Luke Skywalker who is confronted by and tempted by pride and by things that would draw him into the dark side, which is what we see in the original trilogy. It's a completely different thing now to have Luke Skywalker who is a psychopath and who is now willing to kill his own nephew, a young boy, while he sleeps in order to save the galaxy. This is a Luke Skywalker, like I said, who is now a psychopath. He is willing to carry out gravely immoral actions, kill an innocent person in their sleep, because the end justifies the means. That is not the Luke Skywalker of the original trilogy. That is not the Luke Skywalker of Star Wars. This is a completely different character. So to suggest they're just, slight variations on a theme is completely disingenuous. They're not. It's a completely different idea altogether about that character. With George Lucas in the prequels, even though it was imperfect, at least he understood that with Anakin, I have to give you a reason, a journey that he goes on, and I have to give you reasons why he now goes from being this guy who's the hero to the guy who is willing to fight for the most oppressive evil force in the galaxy. He didn't just sort of a sudden go from being the hero to suddenly now doing evil things. There's a progression that happens, and we see this deterioration in his virtue, in his character. He becomes more impulsive. He becomes desperate. He's invested in trying to act for his own self-interest. We don't see any of that with Luke. It's just all of a sudden he's standing over his own nephew and is contemplating murdering him in his sleep. Where did that come from? That's the problem with that character.
Briefest moment of pure instinct. I thought I could stop it.
And he's still scared of the darkness hiding inside himself, just as he was as a young man back on Dagobah. Although this older version of Luke Skywalker is consistent with his characterization from the original trilogy...
How? You can't just make a claim like that and then not back it up. How is it consistent? Like I've said, this now is a very different Luke. This is a totally different Luke. Mark Hamill said this is a completely different Luke. And you're just saying, oh, no, it's totally consistent. How is it consistent? He's got the same name, and it's the same actor playing him, and he is the same character, in a sort of purely, I guess at a maybe more basic and sort of superficial level, but at a substance level, a substantial level, who he is substantially, is a very different character now.
Angry fans still believe that The Last Jedi represents a downgrading of his power and his status.
No, they don't believe it represents a downgrading of his power. Again, the power mythology you started with is now coming back to haunt your thesis. And it doesn't represent a downgrading of his status. It represents a misrepresentation of who the character of Luke Skywalker is. You can still have a vulnerable Luke. You can still have an older Luke who's got his own issues and struggles. You still could have done all that. But you needed to do it in a way that was technically proficient, in a way that was well written. And that's the problem. It's a mischaracterization. It's a beloved character who has now been taken and reduced to some absurd, almost comedic caricature. And the fans go, who's that? It's not the fans going, oh, where's his power? Or where's his status? It's the fans going, what? Who's this guy? That's not that guy. This is a different guy here. Why? If you'd filled in the blanks, they wouldn't be asking the why and they wouldn't be disappointed.
But I didn't see you.
The fan fury is exacerbated by the fact that it's a young, untrained female Jedi
You've closed yourself off from the Force.
who challenges this mythic hero on his failures.
Of course you have.
Not only does this young woman reprimand the great Luke Skywalker,
Leia sent me here with hope. If she was wrong, she deserves to know why. We all do.
she directly confronts him and inspires him to reconnect with the Force. Later on, Yoda offers guidance too, but it's Rey who opens the door for Luke to overcome his paralyzing self-doubt.
Now, reach out.
So instead of seeing the old Jedi Master teaching Rey how to wield the awesome power of the Force,
I feel something.
audiences are treated to scenes in which Rey reminds Luke what it means to be a Jedi.
The galaxy may need a legend.
Of course, Rey isn't a more powerful Jedi than Luke, and she ends up being wrong about her ability to fix Kylo Ren. But she does possess something that he's lost. Rey still has hope, she still has conviction, and she still has clarity of purpose. The idea that a young woman like Rey would have something important to teach an older, mythic male hero like Luke Skywalker is erroneously viewed by some male fans as emasculating.
Again, mate, just stop it with the psychoanalysis. You don't know these people. You're not qualified to be doing this. Just don't do it. It's a passive-aggressive and condescending insult. It's effectively a way of you trying to present yourself as being a more virtuous, a more enlightened, and a more perfect male specimen. We all have our flaws, we all have our struggles. It's not about emasculation, it's about bad writing. That's the problem here. So just stop it. Get back to the actual arguments and points that people are making, which, by the way, you have hardly addressed any of them in this video. And we're almost finished, and you have left the actual bulk of the sound arguments and positions that people are putting forward to why this film is so flawed. You've left them all on the cutting room floor.
It's worth pointing out that angry fan defensiveness isn't necessarily just a reaction to women existing in popular science fiction stories. If women are included alongside male heroes in a way that doesn't overshadow, upstage, or interfere with traditional expressions of masculinity,
let's get one thing straight. I'm in charge out here. You do everything I say exactly as I say it.
Excuse me?
Just relax.
then we don't see these same kind of extended temper tantrums from male fans. Especially if the female characters in question are cast as young, white, and conventionally attractive.
Sorry, I had to chuckle at that because, again, dude, just stop it. You're not qualified, you don't know these people, it's just condescending arrogance on your part. It's not really helping your cause anyway, it's just further confirming for people that you're not really listening or understanding the flaws in the film. But it is hilarious, again with the racism accusations, but I mean, what's the counter argument here? That basically, leave aside the race, but elderly and overweight, I'm not convinced that's necessarily what you're looking for and a superhero, I'm not sure if they're going to possess some of the, well, what should we call them, the essential qualities that you need, the physical aspects in order to fulfill the job description. I guess that's the way I can put it most delicately. But again, with the condescending insults, more importantly, it's not true. As I said, the same group of male fans who had problems with The Last Jedi absolutely love films like Terminator 2. They absolutely love films like Aliens. And what do you have in those films? Especially if you look at both those films, in fact, you would say that both of the female leads, not only do they save the day, and they're so pivotal in saving the day, but they do defy the conventions when it comes to sort of beauty. I mean, Linda Hamilton had bulked up, and she actually looks more masculine than feminine in her physical form in that film. She's not portrayed as this petite, beautiful, dainty thing at all. She's a hardened warrior. Ripley, again, they are not conventional standards of beauty or dainty femininity at all. And yet they are loved. Why? Because they're well-written characters and well-written films. That's the thing you're missing.
The Last Jedi isn't satisfied with simply including women. It goes much further, and puts female characters in positions of institutional power or moral authority over male heroes. The movie then has those women leverage that power to challenge and ultimately force change in men's behavior.
Tell me the truth.
And that is almost unheard of in a major blockbuster film.
Now, remember that point I told you to remember at the very beginning, when he claimed there was no agenda here? What he's describing here is this was done deliberately. If it's done deliberately, that's what an agenda is. An agenda simply means that you have acted intentionally a certain way. You've already got a plan in mind and you have acted out on that plan. And that's what he's suggesting happened here, that this has been done deliberately. And obviously it's been done deliberately to try and teach us an important life lesson. So that's an agenda. So which is it? Because this is now contradicting the earlier point that was made in this essay that this wasn't done deliberately, that there was no agenda here to try and teach a different view of male-female relationships. Well, now he's saying that's exactly what these characters are about. Or is this not what he means? I mean, I'm confused by this because, as I said, this actually seems to be completely contradictory to the original point he made, claiming that it wasn't deliberately done this way.
In the end, our three male heroes face up to their mistakes and overcome their failures. Poe learns from Leia and Holdo to put aside his desire for heroic short-term gains.
Let's go. No, wait.
And instead consider the bigger picture.
Well, first of all, has he really learnt that? There's not really enough substance at the end of that film to show that he has undergone that type of change. I guess we'll have to wait and see till the next film and see what he's like then. In many ways, you'd have to say that you could argue, and I think quite effectively too, that like most of the characters in this film, he hasn't really gone on any sort of meaningful character arc or journey. He's still largely the same character. Stopping a guy and saying don't go out yet is simply a strategic decision, but we saw him making strategic decisions at the very beginning of the film. The whole point of trying to destroy the Dreadnought was a strategic decision, or what he believed to be a strategic decision. So I'm not convinced that this represents a major change in his character.
It's only through Rose's moral insights that Finn comes to believe in something bigger than himself.
Again, is that what's really happened here, or is Finn simply doing what Finn has done previously, which has become so invested in a female friend that his friendship is what motivates them? It's not so much the cause, but her that he's invested in. We'll find out in the next film, I guess, but this film doesn't make it clear that there's anything majorly different going on here in the life of this particular character.
And Rey succeeds in inspiring Luke to be the best version of himself again.
And this, again, for me, is a factual claim worth challenging. In actual fact, I'd argue, if you go back and look at the film, it's really Yoda is the one who instructs Luke. It's Yoda is the one who challenges and teaches and changes Luke from going from one position to the other. It's not Rey. Rey acts as a catalyst, but she is not the mentor in the situation at all. It's Yoda, I would argue, in this film. To me, saying that Rey is like the mentor or the most important thing in this character's journey here to the transformative moment is kind of like saying that R2-D2 is the mentor to Luke Skywalker in A New Hope, because he's got the message which prompts Luke to end up going and seeing Obi-Wan Kenobi. No, it's Obi-Wan Kenobi who's the mentor. And in the same way, Rey is a catalyst which brings Luke into this relationship once again with his former teacher. And that's the point of conversion or change.
And ultimately to do the exact thing he mocked her for earlier in the film. Luke does indeed end up walking out with a laser sword and facing down the whole First Order.
In actual fact, Luke does not end up walking out and facing down the entire First Order. He Skypes in for the session. It is a day at home. I'm working from home today, chaps. He doesn't turn up. And I think it's important. This is important. This might seem like semantics. Oh, he's there as a hologram. Yeah, but he's not there in person. And I think a lot of people at that point, see, that fact alone really undercut his sacrifice. I think him turning up would have been so essential, because he didn't turn up, he didn't fight, the risk is minimised, the whole confrontation is actually stripped of its authentic human content. Two people, person to person, in the same place, now facing down the former pupil, the former master, once again together. No, there's none of that. He's actually transported himself by his force powers into the situation, and then he has some kind of force stroke or something at the end and dies. It's a very unsatisfying conclusion. But most importantly, he doesn't actually turn up in person to fight the battle. And I think a lot of people, well, he did rightly felt undercut by that. It just seemed like a very cheap stunt. It was a weird stunt too, because it was so unnecessary. Everything was there to have him actually turn up and to fight the battle in person. And then for the sacrifice, the self-sacrificial act to be truly meaningful. Not just some weird delaying tactic involving him and a hologram and a strange sort of largely unexplained death where he just sort of pops an artery and disappears into the Force.
Despite what the reactionary conspiracy theorists claim, this is not an agenda of masculine inferiority. Women in The Last Jedi hold their male counterparts accountable not out of animosity, but because they genuinely care about them.
And again, that might be true of Princess Leia, and it might be true of Rey in her relationship to Luke. It's not true of Vice Admiral Holdo in her relationship to Poe. It really isn't. Her relationship to him is very much one, it starts out from the very beginning, she disdains the type of character she believes him to be. She has disdain for him. She's threatened by him. She considers him a danger. She has an absolute distrust and dislike of him as a character. So to claim that she's acting out of love for him, no, that's not what the film establishes. If you want that to be true, Rian Johnson needed to actually write that, and he didn't write that.
I like him.
Me too.
Male heroes are not being diminished or erased in this movie. In fact, a lot of time and effort is devoted to giving men transformative arcs. The Last Jedi is a story about men learning to trust women's ideas and decisions, and then becoming better people and better heroes because of it.
How have they become better heroes? The film does not, by any stretch, establish that they have become better heroes. And it's not really convincing that they've become better people either. This is not a well-written film. And you can't just say, well, that's what's happened because I'm seeing things in here that I believe to be true. You've actually got to show how that is true. And I think when you look at the film in an objective way, you can't show how they've become better heroes as a result of the way these particular characters are written.
And while that might be an unexpected message for a Star Wars story, it's a vital lesson that men need to learn if we are to achieve gender equality.
What the heck? What are you talking about? If you wanna improve male-female relations in the world, don't sit in front of a movie. That's not how you become a more moral and virtuous person. Certainly not how you become a more virtuous and moral male. You become a more virtuous and moral person by improving your character and practicing virtue in the world. That's how you do it. Secondly, what does that even mean, that final line? This will improve gender equality. What inequality are you referring to? Is it illegal in your country for women to vote or to drive or to have their own financial affairs? Are they the property of men? Do they not have the same legal rights as men in your country? They do in my country. So what inequality exactly do you believe that this is going to put us on the path to actually fixing? I mean, I'm really interested to know what exactly you believe this is going to improve. Effectively for me, this video essay is one very long and convoluted version of that tired old falsehood that if you didn't like this film, you're a racist and a sexist. That's all he's done here is repeat that same straw man. He's very selectively cherry-picked one very tiny slither of critique that people made about this film, honed in on, and completely ignored all the rest of it. And then he's created the straw man where he, I would argue, has completely failed to diagnose the real problem here. The problem is the writing of these characters. The problem is the writing of the story in which these characters exist. If it had been written better, if the characters had been written better, if the story had been written better, then you wouldn't have a group of formerly committed fans who were extremely unhappy. You wouldn't have the worst Star Wars film that's ever been made. And you wouldn't need to be making this excuse that the only problem here is that it subverted our expectations. Like I've said previously, yes, it did subvert expectations. We expected to go and see a well-made, or at least a proficiently made film that was enjoyable. That's not the experience we had. Our expectations were subverted in a way that led to great disappointment. And so people are simply expressing that disappointment online. And there's nothing wrong with doing that, by the way. As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please let me know what you think in the comments section below. If you like the content I'm creating and you'd like to see more of it, then please support me on PayPal or Patreon. There's a link for both in the description below. I'll see you next time on Left Foot Media.